In one life, Jane was a masterpiece hidden in a basement, a woman who poured her soul into someone else's blueprints, only to be left behind in the rain on a cold Pennsylvania driveway. It was a tragic end for a brilliant mind, a life cut short by the very person she was supposed to trust. But sometimes, the universe realizes its math is wrong. Today we follow Jane as she wakes up 10 years in the past, given a rare and powerful chance to do it all over again. This isn't just a story about avoiding a tragic end. It's about the fierce, methodical journey of a woman claiming the fulfilling life she always deserved. From the grit of the selvage district to the quiet warmth of a connection that defies the laws of physics. This is Jane's second chance at structural integrity. The rain had stopped about 20 minutes ago, leaving the air thick and smelling like wet pavement. Jane was lying on the ground. She wasn't moving because she couldn't. Her lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass, and every time she tried to take a breath, a sharp, stabbing pain flared in her chest. She was wearing a white dress she'd bought for a dinner that never happened. Now it was soaked through, stained with gray mud from the estate's driveway. The house loomed over her, a massive, modern structure of glass and concrete that she had spent 3 years designing. She'd hand-picked the blue-tinted stones for the walkway. She'd calculated the exact slope of the drainage system. Now, she watched as the rainwater she'd diverted so efficiently washed her own body heat into the storm drains. She'd been sick for 3 weeks. Albert, her husband, had told her it was just a cold. He'd brought her tea in the basement office where she worked, telling her he'd call the doctor as soon as she finished the load-bearing specs for his new skyscraper project. She'd finished them. Then he'd locked the door. She'd managed to get out through a window, but she didn't have her phone or her keys. She just wanted to get to the main road. She didn't make it. Jane looked up at the dark sky. She was 30 years old. And she was dying because she'd let a man convince her that her own name didn't matter as much as their success. She felt a surge of pure, lucid anger. Witness this, she thought, pressing her cheek into the wet stone. Don't let him get away with it. Suddenly, the freezing cold vanished. It felt like someone had wrapped a heavy electric blanket around her. The air smelled like a thunderstorm and old wood. She felt herself being lifted, not physically, but her entire mind felt cradled. I see you. A vibration hummed through her bones. Everything went white. Jane woke up with a start, gasping for air. Her lungs didn't hurt. She wasn't on a driveway. She was on a lumpy futon in a room that smelled like cheap vanilla body spray and unwashed laundry. She sat up, her head spinning. On the desk next to her was a half-empty plastic cup of lukewarm juice and a stack of Calculus 2 textbooks. Oof, you're finally awake, a girl said. Jane turned. It was Nina, her freshman roommate. Nina was pulling on a gray hoodie, her eyes red from a long night. That party was a total bust. I told you we shouldn't have done those shots with the engineering guys. You're only 18, Jane. You're not built for that. Jane looked at her hands. No blue tint, no wrinkles, just the slightly ink-stained fingers of a college student. She looked at the calendar pinned to the wall. February 2016. She was back. She was a freshman at the university, 10 years before the driveway. Nina, Jane said, her voice sounding steadier than it should. I'm changing my classes. I'm fast-tracking my degree. What? You're already a year ahead of everyone, Nina said, pausing with her hand on the door. I'm going to be 10 years ahead, Jane replied. Jane didn't go to any more parties. For the next 2 years, she lived in the library and the lab. She treated her life like a construction project. She kept Nina close because Nina was practical. Nina was pre-med and kept Jane fed and hydrated when she forgot to eat. Then there was Sloane, a pre-law student Jane met in a coffee shop. Jane hired her literally, with what little money she had to look over the first patent she filed at age 19. You're putting your name on this alone? Sloane asked, looking at the seismic dampening designs. Yes, Jane said. Only mine. The third member of her circle was Becca, a textile major. While Jane dealt with steel and concrete, Becca understood how materials moved. They spent nights at a 24-hour diner, Becca explaining the weave of fabric while Jane translated it into bridge cables. And then there was Jelly. Jelly was a mythology major with parents who lived in a commune. She was Jane's window into the weird. One night, while Jane was working on a mineral calcification theory, Jelly looked up from a book on Greek tragedy. You ever hear of the Auditor? Jelly asked. The gods used him to keep the loom of fate running. He was a human soldier who went crazy with grief and killed a whole village. As punishment, they took his heart and his memory and made him watch the world without feeling anything. But the legend says if he sees a mortal getting cheated by fate, he can jam the gears and become human again. Jane felt a prickle at the back of her neck. For months, she'd seen a shimmer in the corner of her eye, a ripple in the air that followed her. What happens if he becomes human? Jane asked. He becomes a thread, Jelly said. He has to live like the rest of us. Fragile. While Jane was burying herself in work, another student named Albert was starting his sophomore year at a different university, 3 states away. Albert was smart, but he was lazy. He realized early on that he didn't need to do the math if he could convince a girl in his physics lab that he was inspired by her. He'd sit close to her, lean in just enough to be intimate without being obvious, and complement her unique perspective. He was a master of the co-authored lie. By the end of the term, his name was first on her research paper, and he'd managed to make her feel like he'd done her a favor by being involved. He didn't know Jane existed yet. In the original timeline, they would have met in 2 years at a prestigious bridge-building seminar in Chicago. In this life, Jane had already deleted that seminar from her calendar, scrubbed the very possibility of him from her future. Back at Jane's school, she met Leo. Leo was in her advanced materials lab, and he was everything the old Jane would have fallen for. He was cute, with messy curly hair and a genuine, almost nerdy love for eco-friendly concrete. They became fast friends. They spent hours in the lab, and Leo would show up unprompted with extra shot lattes, remembering exactly how much sugar she took. He was the first guy who actually listened when she talked about seismic dampening. He didn't try to explain her own theories back to her. He just watched her, his eyes bright with something that wasn't greed or academic competition. One Tuesday night, after a 12-hour stint testing carbon fiber tension, he walked her back to her dorm. The air was crisp, and the streetlights cast long, amber shadows across the quad. Near the entrance, Leo stopped. "Jane," he said softly. He stepped closer, reaching out to tuck a stray hair behind her ear. He began to lean in, his intent clear. Jane froze. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was a biological shutdown. Suddenly, the shimmer in the air, the strange ripple that had been following her since she woke up in this timeline turned ice cold. The temperature around them seemed to drop 20 degrees in a second. Jane pulled back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She gave him a tight, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I can't, Leo. I've got a lot of work to do. So much work." Leo's face fell, his hand hovering in the empty space where she had been. He looked disappointed, but he was a good man, so he stepped back. "I get it. The PhD track is a beast. See you tomorrow, Jane." He didn't know that as he walked away, a man made of starlight and ancient memories was watching from the deep shadows of the library arches, slowly, painfully learning the rhythm of a human breath. Later that night, the dorm room was quiet, lit only by the blue glow of Jane's laptop. Nina and Becca were sprawled on the floor, sharing a bag of pretzels while Sloane sat cross-legged on her bed, highlighting a law textbook. So, Nina started, not looking up. "Leo?" He's basically a golden retriever in human form. Why did you shut him down? Jane kept her eyes on her structural simulations. I told you, I don't have time. Jane, you're a genius. You finish your week's work by Wednesday, Sloane chimed in, pointing her highlighter at her. He's nice. He's brilliant. He actually likes you. What's the real reason? Jane opened her mouth to give a scripted answer about career goals, but she stopped. For a split second, the dorm room disappeared. The smell of vanilla spray was replaced by the scent of ozone and cedar. The blue light of her screen became the blinding white of a Pennsylvania storm. She saw a flash of a figure, too tall, too bright, bending over her in the mud. She felt the sensation of being lifted, not by arms, but by a force that felt like the very foundation of the world. She remembered the feeling of that warmth, a heat so absolute it had made the cold of death feel like a distant memory. The image vanished as quickly as it came, leaving her breathless. She looked at her friends, her fingers trembling slightly on the keyboard. I just don't want to date, Jane said finally. Her voice was flat, final. Not him. Not anyone. I'm not here for that this time. Her friends exchanged a look, sensing a wall they couldn't climb. They went back to their pretzels and their books, leaving Jane to stare at the screen, wondering why a ghost from a life she had lost felt more real than the man standing right in front of her. By the time Jane was 21, she had finished both her bachelor's and her master's. She was a prodigy in the engineering world, a name whispered in faculty lounges and corporate boardrooms alike. But Jane didn't take the high-paying internships at the big firms in the glass and steel canyons of downtown. She didn't want a desk, she wanted a foundation. Instead, she went to the Selvage District, a run-down, salt-crusted industrial area of the city where the cranes looked like dinosaurs. She worked with the old masons and the veteran steelworkers, men who had been poor in footings since before she was born. She learned how to pour concrete in the freezing rain without it cracking and how to weld a seam in a gale-force wind. She was building a reputation as someone who knew the grit, not just the equations. She was making herself unkillable. States away, Albert watched her. He followed her progress through academic journals and industry newsletters, his eyes narrow and clouded with a strange, heavy melancholy. Every time her face appeared on his screen, decked out in a hard hat and a high-waist vest, he felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest. It wasn't heartbreak, and it wasn't even quite greed. It was a physical manifestation of a phantom loss he couldn't name. He would stare at her photo until the pixels blurred, clutching his sternum as a dull ache radiated toward his shoulder. It felt as though a limb had been amputated, leaving him to reach for a ghost that wasn't there. I should know her, he thought, the sadness pooling in his gut as he struggled through a failing structural simulation on his second monitor. If she were here, this wouldn't be so hard. We would be at the top by now. He didn't understand why the sight of a stranger in a different state made him feel like a widower. He just knew that her absence in his life felt like a personal theft, a cosmic error that left him drowning in a grief he hadn't earned. He felt a deep, hollow sadness because he was struggling alone, haunted by the crushing certainty that he was supposed to have a partner and that she was the one. Jane, meanwhile, was in Jelly's graduate housing, a cramped room that was more paper than floor space. Jelly looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, a cold cup of tea sitting precariously on a stack of folklore texts. I'm deep into the thesis now, Jelly said, rubbing her temples. I'm focusing on the auditor, Reverie. I've decided on his turning point. In my version of the myth, he regains his humanity by watching a girl die in a driveway. He decides that the math of her death is a structural error in reality. So, he breaks the loom to save her. Jane sat on the edge of Jelly's unmade bed, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. How does the story end? For him, I mean. It's a tragedy and a comedy at the same time, Jelly sighed, leaning back. He was originally a general, a man of absolute order. The legend says he once wiped out an entire coastal village because they failed to protect his wife while he was at war. He thought he was balancing the scales of justice by erasing everyone who failed her. The gods disagreed. They turned him into the Auditora machine of fate with no memory, no heart, and no choice. He was supposed to watch the world bleed for eternity without ever feeling a drop of it. Jelly shuffled some papers, looking for a specific translation. To be truly free, he has to do more than just save her. He has to stay inoptimized. He has to choose to be inefficient. To love something that has no ROI. If he tries to go back to being perfect or powerful, the loom just reabsorbs him. But for now, he's just a guy who doesn't know how to be a guy. He's a god who has to learn how to tie his shoes. Jane looked at the corner of the room. The shimmer wasn't just a ripple anymore. It was solid. A silhouette of a man stood by the bookshelf, his eyes glowing with the soft, muted light of a dying star. He looked lost, his hands hanging awkwardly at his sides, as if he didn't know what they were for. "I see you," Jane whispered. Jelly blinked, looking at the corner and then back to Jane. "See who? The ghost of my GPA?" She let out a humorless laugh and rubbed her eyes. "God, Jane, you're as tired as I am. You're hallucinating. Let's go get some coffee before we both start seeing celestial beings in the furniture." Jane blinked, and the figure was gone. She shook her head, forcing a smile. Right. Hallucinations. Too much concrete, not enough sleep. But as she stood up, the air in the corner of the room remained warm, smelling faintly of ozone and ancient cedar. The National Engineering Excellence Gala was held in a ballroom that felt like a cage of diamonds. Crystal chandeliers hung low from the ceiling, throwing sharp, fractured light across the heavy velvet curtains and the polished marble floor. Jane stood at the center of a small circle of industry titans. Her charcoal gray dress a sharp, professional contrast to the soft pastels and sequins of the other guests. The gold medal was a physical weight against her chest, a cold reminder of the 10 years of life she had compressed into 5. She looked expensive and untouchable, a fortress of a woman who had built her own walls long before she ever poured a foundation in the Selvage district. Across the room, Albert adjusted his tie. He was 25 now, his face thinner and more hairy than the version Jane remembered from her past life. He was a PhD student at a mid-tier university, currently drowning in the fallout of a misunderstanding where he'd been caught borrowing significant portions of his advisor's latest data. He was desperate for a win, for a tether to pull him out of the academic gutter. When he saw Jane, that familiar, unexplainable phantom pain flared in his chest, a sharp, hot needle behind his sternum. He gasped, clutching his drink. It felt as though a vital piece of his own soul was standing 30 feet away, wearing charcoal silk and talking to a senator. He didn't know why, but the sight of her made him feel like a man who had forgotten the name of his own wife. He forced a breath, smoothed his hair, and walked toward her, putting on his practiced, "I'm just a charmingly awkward nerd" smile. "Dr. Harris? I'm Albert," he said, his voice hitching slightly. "I've been reading your work on seismic ratios and mineral calcification. It's brave, truly, but perhaps a bit too technical for the public? I've got some connections with big developers who find the grit of the selvage a bit off-putting. I have a knack for translating brilliance into funding. We could collaborate. We'd be a powerhouse." Jane turned to him. For a moment, the ballroom vanished. She didn't see the 25-year-old student. She saw the man who had sat by her bed and told her she was just tired while her lungs turned to stone. She remembered the tea he had served her that tasted like nothing, the taste of indifference. She remembered the click of the basement door lock. Her expression didn't change. It remained as clinical and cold as a blueprint. "The math is wrong, Albert," Jane said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a frequency that seemed to cut through the ambient jazz of the room. Albert blinked, his smile faltering. "I beg your pardon?" "You assume that you can add yourself to someone else's work and get a positive result," she said. stepping closer until she was well within his personal space, her eyes boring into his. But in engineering, if you add a 0 to a masterpiece, the sum doesn't change. And if you're a negative, you compromise the entire structure. You are a facade, Albert. You think you're a translator, but you're just a parasite looking for a host. I don't build on sand, and I certainly don't collaborate with people who don't have a foundation. Go away. She didn't wait for a response. She walked past him, the silk of her dress brushing against his arm like an insult. Albert stood frozen. The people around them, heads of firms, former professors, rivals, dropped their voices into jagged whispers. He could feel their eyes on him, stripping away his polished exterior. His face turned a deep, ugly red, the color of a bruised ego. But beneath the embarrassment, the phantom pain in his chest reached a crescendo. He watched her walk away and felt a crushing, illogical sense of abandonment. It wasn't just that she had humiliated him. It felt as if she had just outright killed him, and he had no idea why he deserved it. He stayed there in the center of the room, a man who had lost a war he didn't even know he was fighting. Jane stepped through the heavy French doors. The sudden bite of the night air, a welcome relief from the suffocating scent of expensive perfume and ego inside. The city lights of the Selvage district sparkled in the distance like fallen stars, a reminder of the work that actually mattered. "You shouldn't be here," she said to the empty air. She didn't turn around. She had felt that familiar drop in temperature the moment she stepped onto the stone. "I wasn't," a voice replied. It sounded less like a person speaking and more like the low hum of a power transformer. "Until I was." Jane turned, expecting the usual ripple in the air. Instead, she found a man leaning against the stone railing. He looked to be in his late 20s, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit right, as if the fabric were struggling to contain a shape it wasn't designed for. His eyes were the most unsettling part. They weren't a single color, but a shifting, muted gray that looked like static on an old television, occasionally sparking with the white-hot light of a dying sun. "Who are you?" Jane asked, her voice steady despite the way the hair on her arms stood up. "And don't give me a riddle. I want a name." The man straightened up. He didn't move toward her, but the air around him began to distort. The suit didn't just change. It seemed to dissolve into a shifting cloak of deep indigo and silver. His height stretched, and for a terrifying second, his face flickered not into a monster, but into a kaleidoscope of 1,000 different men. A soldier in bronze armor, a monk in tattered robes, a weeping husband over a grave. The shimmer expanded until it filled the balcony, a towering silhouette of pure, structured energy that smelled of ozone and ancient cedar. The pressure in Jane's ears spiked. "I am the one who witnessed." The entity vibrated. "I am the auditor of the loom. I was the machine of the inevitable, until your prayer jammed the gears. I am Reverie." The light faded, collapsing back into the shape of the man in the ill-fitting suit. He looked exhausted. His shoulders slumped as he gripped the railing to steady himself. "What do you want?" Jane asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Why follow me for 5 years? Why intervene?" Reverie looked out at the city, his eyes finally settling into a steady, dark blue. "The math of your death was a structural error. I did not want to watch it happen again. I do not want anything. I am learning what wanting feels like. It is very heavy." Jane watched him. He looked lost, like a piece of architecture that had been ripped out of a cathedral and placed in the middle of a crowded street. She thought of the driveway, the warmth she had felt as she died, and the cold rejection she had just handed to Albert. "You saved me," she said, her voice softening. "I owe you that. Oh, but if you're going to stay, we need a foundation. We need rules." Reverie tilted his head, curious. "Rules?" "Boundaries," Jane corrected, stepping closer. "You don't stand in the corner of my bedroom. You don't show up in the middle of my board meetings as a ripple in the air. If you're going to be a part of this life, you have to be in it. You stay human. You eat, you walk, you talk, and you ask permission before you enter my space. I do not know how to be human well, Reverie admitted. I do not understand why you drink bean water that makes your heart race, or why you stare at glowing rectangles for 10 hours. I'll teach you, Jane said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her professional mask. But the moment you stop being a person and start being a force of nature again, you're out. I've spent this life building a fortress, Reverie. I won't let a ghost, even a helpful one, haunt it. Reverie looked at his hands, flexing his fingers as if marveling at the fact that they were solid. I accept your boundaries, Jane Harris. I will be human. Good, Jane said, turning back to the city. Now go find a suit that actually fits. You look like a hired assassin from a low-budget movie. She didn't look back, but she could feel the ozone scent lingering, a quiet promise that for the first time in 2 lives, she wasn't building alone. For the next year, Jane lived in a state of high-functioning chaos. Her PhD dissertation, a massive, theoretical leap in self-healing polymers for bridge supports, was consuming her nights, while Reverie was consuming her patience. Following Jane's human-only rule was proving to be a logistical nightmare for a man who had spent 2 millennia as a celestial vibration. Jane would often find him at the campus coffee shop, sitting perfectly still at a corner table for 4 hours. He didn't read. He didn't scroll on a phone. He just stared at a single blueberry muffin with an intensity that made the baristas nervous. It has a recursive texture, Reverie told her one afternoon when she finished a lab session and found him still there. He pointed at the muffin. The crumb structure mimics the erosion patterns of the Aegean coastline. Why do humans apply heat to such complex geometry and then eat it? It's breakfast, Reverie. Just take a bite or leave it alone, Jane sighed, rubbing her temples. I have tried, he whispered, looking genuinely distressed. The sensation of flavor is an overwhelming data spike. It is inefficient. The library was no better. Jane once caught him in the quietest section of the engineering archives, staring at a textbook on fluid dynamics. He was holding the book upside down, his eyes scanning the pages with terrifying speed. When Jane flipped the book right side up for him, he looked at her with genuine confusion. The symbols are universal, Jane. Orientation is a human construct based on gravity. I do not see why the direction of the ink matters to the truth of the math. Nina, meanwhile, had moved past curiosity and into a state of full-blown obsession. She would lean over Jane's laptop in their shared apartment, peering out the window toward the quad. Okay, seriously, Jane. The hot, weird, silent transfer guy is currently standing in the middle of the lawn. He's been looking at that one oak tree for 3 hours. He hasn't checked his watch once. He doesn't even blink normally. Who is he? He's a transfer student, Jane said, not looking up from her polymers. From a very secluded, very religious community. He's adjusting. He looks like he's adjusting to being on a planet with oxygen, Nina countered. He's weird, Jane. He's learning, Jane replied, her voice softening. Just let him be. While Jane was managing a God's social integration, Albert was drowning in the vacuum of his own ego. After the gala, the phantom pain in his chest had become a constant, dull thrum, a reminder of the missing variable he couldn't grasp. Desperate to reclaim his status, he had signed a lucrative side contract with a private developer to replicate Jane's patented dampening system. He had the blueprints. He had the materials. But he lacked the underlying calculus, the spirit of the math that Jane had built into the very bones of the design. He tried to fudge the numbers, shifting decimal points in the stress test simulations to make the results look stable. In the old timeline, he would have gotten away with it. But the loom was compensating. Leo, now a rising star in city policy, had pushed for a rigorous new automated audit system for all private-public engineering ventures. The software flagged Albert's data within seconds. The fallout was swift. Albert was hauled before the ethics committee, his funding was stripped, and he was placed on indefinite academic probation. In the brutal, gossipy world of the engineering department, he became a punchline. The man who tried to improve on a Harris design and proved he couldn't even solve for X. Every time he walked down the hall and heard the snickers, the pain in his chest flared into a searing heat. He felt like he was being erased, while somewhere across the city, Jane Harris was becoming more solid than he had ever been. The opening of the Selvage Bridge was not the typical ribbon-cutting ceremony. There were no diamond-studded scissors, and Jane had insisted on no champagne. Instead, the air was filled with the heavy, industrial thrum of the river and the smell of cold iron. The bridge was a marvel of the selvage integrity, a structure that didn't fight the salt and the wind, but moved with them. It was lean, gray, and absolutely unbreakable. Leo stood at the center of the span, his coat collar turned up against the biting wind. He had traded his lab coat for the tailored suits of a city policymaker, his name now synonymous with the infrastructure revolution Jane had ignited. "You did it, Jane," Leo said, his voice barely carrying over the roar of the water below. He shook her hand, his grip lingering just a second too long. "It's perfect. It's the first thing in this district that feels like it's going to outlast us all." He looked down at her, his eyes softening. There was a decade of what-ifs hanging between them, the lattes he'd brought her, the walks to the dorm, the kiss she'd dodged in the lab years ago. He looked like he wanted to finally say it, to ask if there was room in her fortress for someone like him. But then, his gaze shifted. He saw a figure standing at the very end of the bridge, leaning against a primary tension cable. Reverie was wearing a charcoal flannel shirt and dark jeans. He had finally stopped holding books upside down and had mastered the art of standing in a way that didn't look like a statue, waiting for a bird to land on it. To anyone else, he looked like a handsome, if somewhat intense, local contractor. But to Leo, there was something fundamentally other about him. He stood too still, he didn't squint against the wind, and the way he watched Jane wasn't with the longing of a man, but with the terrifying, absolute focus of a planet orbiting a sun. "Is that him?" Leo asked, his voice dropping an octave. "The transfer student who never left?" "Yeah," Jane said, her eyes already drifting toward the end of the span. "That's him." Leo nodded slowly, a look of quiet defeat crossing his face. He recognized a structural bond he couldn't compete with, a load-bearing connection that defied the standard laws of physics. "I'll see you at the briefing tomorrow, Dr. Harris." Jane walked away. She didn't hurry, but each step felt like a release of tension she'd been carrying for 2 lifetimes. As she approached the end of the bridge, the wind off the river turned into a gale, whipping her hair across her face. She stopped in front of Reverie. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply opened his arms, a gesture he had spent the last year practicing by watching people greet each other at train stations. Jane reached out and hugged him, burying her face in the heavy flannel of his chest. Immediately, the world changed. The sound of the river faded into a low, rhythmic hum. The biting cold of the selvage disappeared, replaced by a golden, absolute warmth that seemed to radiate from the very center of his being. It was the same heat she had felt in the driveway in Pennsylvania, the smell of ozone after a lightning strike, the scent of ancient cedar wood, and the feeling of being completely, undeniably safe. She had known for years that he was the one who had intervened, but feeling the physical echo of that moment was different. It was the resonance of a prayer finally answered. "It was you," she whispered into his chest, her eyes stinging with the first real tears she'd allowed herself in 10 years. "In the rain, when everything was gray and I was so tired. You were the warmth." Reverie wrapped his arms around her, his grip solid and certain. He didn't squeeze too hard, but he held her as if she were the only anchor keeping him tethered to the earth. The celestial vibration in his voice was gone, replaced by something rougher, deeper, and entirely human. "I was the auditor," he said softly into her hair. "I was supposed to watch the pattern, but when you spoke, I didn't want to watch anymore." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his own eyes no longer shifting like static, but settled into a deep, steady blue. "I didn't follow you because I was punished, Jane. I followed you because I wanted to." In that moment, the bridge beneath them felt like the only solid ground in the universe. Jane smiled, reaching up to touch his face. He was unoptimized. He was inefficient. He was exactly what she had died for. 10 years had passed since the night in the dorm room when Jane Harris had first woken up with the taste of a future death in her mouth. Now, standing in the floor-to-ceiling glass office of Harris's Integrity, she watched the sun dip below the skyline of the city she had quite literally reinforced from the ground up. The firm was more than just a business. It was the fortress she had once dreamed of. She had a team of 50 people, and at the core were the women who had helped her build the walls. Nina was the head of occupational health and safety, running the firm with a no-nonsense medical precision that kept every worker on her sites alive. Sloan was the lead counsel, a legal shark who ensured that Jane's name was the only one on every patent, every contract, and every legacy. Becca handled the aesthetics, ensuring that the grit of the selvage was translated into something beautiful and enduring. The hierarchy was perfect. The foundations were deep. As for Albert, he had faded into a gray obscurity that was far more fitting than any grand tragedy. The last Jane had heard, he had been quietly dismissed from a low-level firm after a plagiarism scandal involving a junior intern's CAD files. He was currently working as a night security guard for a suburban shopping mall. He spent his nights walking empty corridors, still clutching his chest whenever a sudden storm broke, feeling a phantom grief for a life he couldn't remember losing. The universe had balanced the books, not through fire, but through the slow, steady application of truth. Jane picked up her coat and stepped out of the office. She walked through the lobby, her heels clicking a rhythmic, confident cadence on the polished stone. When she pushed through the heavy glass doors of the entrance, she saw the black sedan idling at the curb. Reverie was in the driver's seat. He was wearing a dark sweater and a simple watch Jane had bought him for his human birthday, the anniversary of his fall. He still drove with a terrifying, mechanical focus, gripping the steering wheel at exactly 10 and 2 with enough force to potentially crush it. And he never exceeded the speed limit by even a single mile per hour. As she approached the car, he didn't wait for her to reach the door. He stepped out, his movements no longer the jerky approximations of a god, but the fluid, deliberate motions of a man who loved the ground he walked on. "You're late," he said, though there was no judgment in it, only an observation of the passage of time. "It's called a deadline, Reverie," Jane teased, stopping in front of him. "Humans have them." "I am aware," he murmured. He reached out, his hands, large, warm, and entirely solid, finding her waist. Jane didn't hesitate. She stepped into his space, her hands sliding up to rest against his neck. When they kissed, it wasn't a cosmic event or a shimmer of light. It was deep, quiet, and grounded. It tasted like coffee and felt like the sun. It was the heat of a second chance and a new normal for both of them. Reverie pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes were a steady, clear blue, reflecting the city lights around them. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, and led her to the passenger side. He waited for her to settle in before closing the door with a gentle, solid thud. He climbed back into the driver's seat, his hands returning to their disciplined position on the wheel. He looked over at her, the dashboard lights casting a soft glow across his face. "Where to?" he asked. Jane looked out at the city she had helped rebuild, a place where the math was finally right and the structures were built to last. She looked at the man beside her, the god who had chosen to be fragile, the soldier who had found a new war worth winning. She squeezed his hand, her thumb tracing the line of his palm. "Home," she said. "Let's go home." As the car pulled away from the curb, moving at exactly 25 miles per hour into the heart of the city, the shimmer was gone. There was only the road, the warmth, and the long, quiet life they had built out of the ruins of the loom. Thank you for watching until the very end. If you enjoyed the story, drop a comment, like, and subscribe to support the channel. If you could go back 10 years like Jane, what's the first thing you'd delete from your calendar?